Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Thank you for following us to a different time and place this week. I think it will end up being worth your while. We are going to talk about American defense policy today and the role of Congress in establishing American parameters, which is very timely, I think, in light of the Chinese balloon. Before we get to our guest, Seth Cropsey, here is your JPC commercial. The JPC was established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can sign up for our Insight article, and you can see our magazine In Focus Quarterly. The winter issue of In Focus Quarterly is up there now, and Seth Cropsey, today's speaker, is featured as our essay. The spring issue will be devoted to Israel. That's, I have to say, our favorite issue. jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny those. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. It's a big agenda. Now your public service announcement, you are muted. That's it. You can use the Q&A function if you have questions. I'm monitoring. And now our guest, Seth Cropsey. Seth is president of the Yorktown Institute, which is named for the pivotal 1781 maritime battle, reminding us of the requirement that America always needs to be prepared to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our children. Seth was previously senior fellow and director at the Center for American Sea Power at Hudson Institute. He specializes in defense strategy, U.S. foreign and security policy in the Middle East and East Asia, and the future of U.S. naval power. He is himself a Navy veteran. He began his government career at DoD as assistant to then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, and subsequently served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense of the Navy in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. He also served in the Bush administration as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. He's had public diplomacy roles, including at Voice of America, where he ran the editorial policy on solidarity in Poland, among other things. And as director of the U.S. government's International Broadcasting Bureau, he supervised the agency's efforts to increase radio and television broadcasting to the Muslim world. Seems a worthwhile endeavor. He was visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and has been director of the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center. And he's been published and on TV and on radio and online, just about everywhere you think he should be. Seth Cropsey, I am pleased to say, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shoshana. There's a lot going on these days, as you pointed out. What that really requires is not only crisis management, but also some idea of where are we going. And that's the point of the congressional requirement that the administration inform the country and Congress what its plans are for national security and military defense. But the Biden administration, in compliance to that, published its national security strategy this past October, so coming up on 4 or 5 months ago. The document, I think, epitomizes what's wrong with the current administration's strategic perspective. Its greatest failure is this, what I call the securitization of everything, with no focus on any given strategic question. The Biden administration faces a crisis across Eurasia, from Ukraine to the Taiwan Strait. It's engaged itself intellectually in a public task of great importance with no real substance. There's nothing to chew on there. The National Defense Strategy, which was published shortly after the National Security Strategy, simply reinforces the former document's fecklessness. The Biden administration, I think, may well be derelict in its duty to secure America's defenses. However, Congress can act purposefully, which is to say, to compel the administration to embrace a more coherent defense posture and advocate the capabilities and the budgets the military actually requires. This would be well within the legislative branch's constitutional role and apt, given the increasingly perilous world that we're facing. So Congress requires, as I mentioned ago, every administration to publish a national security strategy, but the document is released by that this administration released is really the height of bureaucratization. It's not a defense strategy in any normative respect. It's not a grand strategy. It is rather a sort of kind of signaling, messaging exercise that's aimed primarily at domestic audiences. In one sense, the national security strategy, and the Biden administration is not alone in this. This kind of vagueness is not new to presidential administrations. So, but this document is full of priorities, from countering China and Russia to mitigating climate change and enduring American resilience. But the structure of the Biden national security strategy does point to a kind of strategic rationale, a set of assumptions about the world, about its major actors, and its critical dynamics that are useful to those who want to understand policy. I think 4 elements are relevant. All of them point to a lack of seriousness, and more fundamentally to a lack of strategic change since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. First, the national security strategy released in October is it's an ideological manifesto, not a realistic look at the security elements of Eurasian competition. It begins with the same rhetoric that has become commonplace in any administration's national security strategy. The world, it says, quote, is more dangerous, quote, than at any previous point. Yet the United States remains, or retains at any rate, an enduring role, their words, with its strategies, precepts remaining as sound as they were 10, 20 years ago, or even half a century ago. Notable aspect, I think, is the explicit equivalence between traditional and non-traditional threats. What do I mean? The US must compete and cooperate simultaneously. The climate problems and public health questions, even inflation issues, are worthy of consideration, and they are relevant to a security assessment. Of course, there is an overlap between climate, inflation, health, and other questions, and the nation's broader strategy. But a security strategy is the wrong venue in which to discuss, for example, climate adaptation or an anti-inflationary policy. If every issue is a security issue, none is. Second, The national security strategy shows the degree to which the current administration does not see current Eurasian competition as military competition. This focus on non-traditional security issues dovetails with the Biden administration's doctrines of what they call integrated deterrence. The national security strategy, which I'm going to call NSS, if I'm allowed that bureaucratic shorthand, defines it as combining our strengths to deter America's adversaries. This sort of looks like the smart power that the Obama administration's doctrine advocated, that combined diplomacy and military action to achieve American interests. Well, or as if normal people would call it, statecraft. So much like smart power, integrated deterrence appears to be a meaningless term with no relevance to the national security professional or to any interested citizen. In fact, it's a strategic dog whistle to Biden's political allies that the administration does not prioritize conventional deterrence and warfighting capacity. Integrated deterrence serves to create justifications to cut and reorient defense spending and traditional military means in favor of domestic policy priorities. This points to I think to the third issue, and that is the Biden administration's supposed conviction that American economic resilience is the foundation of national power. In the abstract, this claim is a serious one, but it's no longer 1945 and it's not 1960. The U.S. must apply its power with care and prudence. Instead, the Biden administration has sort of dressed up climate handouts as an anti-inflationary measure. The lost art of net assessment, the art of strategy, can be understood as compelling or inducing an opponent, a foe, to take steps in one's own interest, in our interest. The Biden administration has triggered and sustained an inflationary crisis and concurrently introduced a defense strategy that will hollow out the U.S. military. The administration's point is to justify reducing American military strength because it sees competition as a complex chain of diverse causes. Fourth, the administration's refusal to recognize Iran as a legitimate strategic threat reveals its unwillingness to recognize tangible competition and adapt to new circumstances. The Biden team still clings to the chimerical Obama-era dream of a regional realignment in which Israel and Saudi Arabia were humbled and Iran elevated. The U.S. recently bullied Israel into conceding its maritime space to Hezbollah, and by extension to Iran. Regional integration empowers Iran at the expense of Israel and the Gulf Arabs. All this while, Iran provides Russia with weapons to strike targets throughout Ukraine. Although the new Iran nuclear deal may be dead for now as protests surge in the self-styled Islamic Republic, it will return when the news media conditions have shifted. So the national defense strategy simply doubles down on the national security strategy's mistakes. Indeed, it offers slightly greater clarity as to the military meaning of integrated deterrence. The military has 5 tasks, the first 2 of which protect critical infrastructure and prevent a nuclear strike on the United States homeland. They have either very little to do with the military or very little to do with the current strategic balance, despite bluff and bluster. China and Russia are not on the cusp of attacking the US with nuclear weapons. The priorities list is what was termed in an earlier age conventional deterrence, the ability to prevent adversaries from actually acting decisively to modify the strategic balance by capturing key territories. In turn, the Defense Department will emphasize campaigning, a concept that essentially reduces to conducting daily actions with a vague strategic purpose in peacetime. Why the word campaigning? To convince the casual reader that the Defense Department is engaged in a robust competition and knows it and avoids the obvious reality that the US is completely unready for a major conflict. So that gets us to Congress and defense policy. A more sensible national security strategy would have begun with a recognition of the current geopolitical situation. The struggle for Eurasian mastery that involves the US, China, Russia, Iran, and the various secondary powers throughout the landmass. American strategy has a singular objective: to preserve the existing Eurasian security system and counter Chinese, Russian, and Iranian attempts to overturn it. This requires all elements of national power, but most specifically the military. America's adversaries pose a military threat and seek to achieve their goals by military means, as well as others, but military is the spine. The Biden administration does face a dangerous world. Russia makes nuclear threats. The war in Ukraine drags on. Russia spoils the global food and energy supply. China pressures Taiwan. Xi Jinping has become maximum leader of China. Iranian weapons supply Russian forces fighting in Ukraine, and Chinese technology assists their development. The Biden administration's diffuse and domestically focused response is as inadequate as it is dangerous. The advantage of the federal system with its separation of powers, that is, well, it provides multiple avenues of policy oversight. Only the executive branch can fight a war, which makes sense, and is also constitutional. Modern Americans have forgotten that the very purpose of the presidency, with its sweeping powers, its unitary nature, and strong central character, was to allow it to act with dispatch and with secrecy. As a result, the president has broad latitude in matters of statecraft. That is, when the president employs military force, or diplomatic elements to further American interests. This latitude is not sacrosanct. However, when one shifts to long-term discussions of strategy or force structure, that's a demonstration that there's flexibility built into the way that the federal government operates, and the executive branch in particular. But it is Congress that approves the budgets for the military, and Congress that scrutinizes and holds to account American generals and admirals during wartime. The legislature has a constitutional right to impose its strategic concepts on the executive, so long as individual senators and representatives are not directing military operations. Congress has taken the lead in a constructive manner on military questions in the past in U.S. history. I think most notably, before the Second World War, Carl Vinson spearheaded the 1938 Naval Act, which increased Navy fighting strength by 20%. And then 2 years later, in 1940, the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which sort of kick-started American defense industrial production and provided the Navy with the fighting corps it would need during the Pacific War. In today's context, there are 5 concrete steps that Congress can take to improve America's ability to confront a major Eurasian military challenge. First, Congress can make sure that the force is the correct size. Expanding the services provides a strategic reserve of trained manpower. As the Russian-Ukrainian war shows, modern combat remains brutal and casualties are high. Ensuring that all services meet their annual recruiting targets at a minimum is a military necessity. Even more reasonable, however, would be to expand the Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force's top-line personnel numbers to ensure that they can sustain damage and keep fighting. Sorry about that. In turn, the remaining restrictions on new recruits should be reevaluated, particularly those that disqualify potential soldiers for crimes that are now legal, so-called crimes. Second, Congress can compartmentalize funding in toto for strategic reinvestment. It's not only the military services and Pentagon that will demand new funds. The Biden administration's national strategies are once again excuses to raid the defense budget. The executive sort of then speaking on behalf of the services, channeling the services. Are doing so to raid the defense budget. The services are under pressure from the Democratic Party. Administration is from the Democratic Party's left and will seek to siphon off as much cash as possible. Some of the endeavors that the Biden administration proposes will be reasonable, in fact, particularly those that ensure that the U.S. has access to specific sovereign capabilities. Example, semiconductor fabrication facilities that can be employed during a major conflict. Yet the competition that America faces requires a significantly enlarged defense budget, something around at least 7% of GDP instead of the current approximately almost 3%. Strategy is another matter where Congress can make a difference and should. Congress can provide the services with the support they need to think about strategy. The services, barring arguably the Marines, are, let's just be as charitable as possible, relaxed on the subject of strategy, with an understanding of their role in modern combat that is vague. Contrary to the still fashionable demands of jointness, and we can talk about that, it's far more intellectually reasonable to begin with the services. Strategic thought requires new blood. This is likely to be found far from the joint staff and standard military operational structures, and particularly within the services themselves. Congress can oversee the revitalization of actual service strategic cultures. Of equal importance, Congress can expand those who participate in actual strategic thought linking with think tanks and the academy far more effectively than today to ensure more comprehensive military thinking. And again, that's something we could talk about also. I mean, Samuel Huntington, the late Samuel Huntington at Harvard, was writing about this, almost 70 years ago, 65 years ago, making roughly the same argument that those who are competent and most knowledgeable about fighting capabilities, namely the military services, should have a powerful input into how the services are used and how they're used together. And lacking that, they're in trouble. Let me move on to the fourth, and then I'll conclude. Congress can revitalize the defense industrial base. This demands far more than simplistic industrial strategies. Improve management techniques, reorganizing who is responsible for acquisition. Rather, it requires supporting smaller defense providers, providing incentives for the development of dual-use technologies, particularly in unmanned contexts, reducing regulatory barriers for defense collaboration, and subsidizing various forms of training, particularly for large industrial production and the repair of warships. In a conflict at sea, which any conflict with China would be, warships will be sunk and some of them will be damaged and they need to be repaired. Over time, automation will provide efficiency and displace much of human labor, but during the current Sino-American competition, manual labor and traditional productivity remain critical. Fifth, Congress can properly fund two critical partly military capacities: a functioning logistics system that's equal to requirements and a more robust space industry. The U.S. military lacks the sea lift capacity to sustain itself in combat. I mean, real combat. Its sea lift capabilities rest on a far broader foundation than just military assets. The U.S. relies on the merchant marine to conduct resupply missions during a major war. Much like America's satellite system, the merchant marine is sufficient for peacetime, but not for wartime. Both require a funding injection and explicit government support. So just to wrap up here, Congress can't make foreign policy wholesale, and that's good. But it can, through prudent, aggressive action, steer the ship of state on the course that it should be taking. Congressional actions like those outlined that I've spoken about here can push back against the Biden administration's attempted erosion of traditional deterrence and military capacities, and ensure that the United States is prepared for any contingency on the Eurasian continent, especially a Sino-American war. And let me leave it at that.
Okay, so thank you. And you've prompted some questions. The first of which is, you mentioned that President Biden and the administration are kind of pitching at domestic audiences, with the green this and all those other sorts of things. But nothing can be done by Congress, it seems to me, without a certain level of public understanding and public agreement as to where we are. So we've got a couple of questions that came in. I'm going to run them together and then let you deal with them. In the past 10 days, we've had news about a Chinese spy balloon flying over Alaska and Canada and across the continental United States. From the public's point of view, is that a blip on the radar, unintended, or maybe that's the tip of the iceberg that will change public interest in defense spending from really negligible to something more positive? It's also possible, we hope, that Iran's selling of drones to Russia that are being used in Ukraine against civilians will also help the public see the nature of the threats. Given the current polarization in Congress, can we have hearings on these things? Do you anticipate that Congress will do its job in bringing the American public with it for whatever it decides to do?
Well, Congress can help by speaking about this, by writing about it in the national media, by telling people they're telling their constituents that this is a serious situation. But that comes down to the partisanship that we are experiencing right now, which is, as you know, is quite bitter. You mentioned the Chinese balloon. The answer to the question about galvanizing public opinion is unclear. But I think what is clear is that the problems that our defenses face today, that I described in the last few minutes, show no sign of being resolved without leadership. It's going to take a president or a very effective and vocal member of Congress or a group of them to get people to understand that the funding level for the military is insufficient to defend the United States. Now, the balloon might awaken people. I don't think that it will. I think that the alternative is to leadership in the executive branch, the president or Congress, is more likely. And that is that some really scarifying event will get people thinking. An attack on Taiwan, for example, God forbid. Well, yes. I hope it's not necessary to say I don't want to see that happen, right? But I am concerned that that we'll simply go on in the path that we have, since the end of the Cold War, thinking that the military that we had at the time that the Cold War ended is in relation to the foes that we face today the same, and it's not. And it's going to take something, either leadership or events, to get Americans to understand that, and then they will act.
Somebody's got to act before the people act. But okay, let's proceed along with that thought about something like an attack on Taiwan, God forbid, would be a galvanizing event, probably for the American public as much as for the military. Isn't that sort of where General Minahan was going? That the possibility that China's designs on Taiwan may be much shorter term than the intelligence community, which says we've got about 10 years till China is going to do it. And General Minahan said, no, maybe there are reasons they'll do it in 2 years or 3 years. Was he trying to kind of prod people into thinking about those unthinkable thoughts and get them to move?
I hope he was, but it's important to note that General Minahan's not alone. There have been others who have made similar remarks. I mean, going back several years, not only the current U.S. commander of forces in the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, but his predecessor have both said that the possibility of a PRC, of a communist Chinese attack over the Taiwan Straits is likely within the next 5 years, or possible within the next 5 years. And their warning was, we're not prepared for it. So yes, I think that was exactly what General Minahan was was trying to do, and I think that's what other four-star officers have been trying to do in the past. And, are they listening?
Is who listening becomes part of the question.
Are you listening? Are we listening?
I mean,
It's
I'm
kind
sort of listening. I'm worried about what he said
Yeah.
because I think he made a pretty decent case
Yeah.
for China changing its timeline. But then you go and look at Congress, and this is your thing, the looking at Congress part. The public tends to think about the defense budget in terms of dollars spent. And you can say, we need to go from 3.5% to 7% of GDP to make it enough money. But it's also true that Congress last year passed a defense budget that was in fact larger than the administration requested. So it's not just the money, it's where we spend it. Congress agreed to those energy related and anti-climate related subsidies and all those things that aren't really in the nature of strategic defense. How do we get Congress, first of all, to focus on the specific threats that we face? But secondly, is it possible to shift money within the defense budget from things that I would call maybe nice to have, but not essential to our defense, to procurement, recruitment, training, retention, things that are in fact necessary?
Well, yeah, it is certainly possible to reprogram funds to the Defense Department, but one has to anticipate what the Defense Department is going to say and what the administration is likely to say when faced with that prospect, which is, what is it you want us to sacrifice? Okay, so the usual trade-off, at least within Navy, is that when the budgets get tight, the priority is operations. So things like repairs and maintenance get kind of put on the back burner as much as possible, and the money that exists is spent to make sure that that the ships that are out there continue to do the missions that are assigned to them in defense of the country. And that's the problem that we're always going to face. So and we haven't even said a word about procurement.
I'm going to. Do we need more shipyards? I mean, I have understood, this is not my area, it's yours. I have understood that if we want to build new ships or increase the fleet, we need shipyards. So do we have to go back and begin procurement changes at the very bottom? We have just talked to Lockheed Martin about Stinger missiles, and we were told it would take almost 3 years to get factory production lines of Stinger missiles up, delivering to the government. Shipyards, all of that. How far back do we have to go?
Well, we need more shipyards, right? Yes, Shoshana, the answer is yes, we need more shipyards. Right now, the shipyards are supposed to be producing 2 nuclear attack submarines, nuclear powered attack submarines, and 1 new member of the triad submarine, which is to say a ballistic missile carrying submarine per year, the Columbia class, so-called Columbia class. That is, we're not making it. We're not achieving those goals. It's less than that 3. Although the Defense Industrial Base refers to it as 5 because the Columbia class is more complicated and bigger than the Virginia class, but let's not go there. We ought to be at a minimum producing 5 attack submarines per year. That's a bare minimum. And where do I get that figure? From the demand that a conflict in the West Pacific would incur. In other words, a conflict with China, because of the stealth that comes with submarines, and their relative invulnerability to Chinese missiles, which are preponderant in their numbers. They have a lot of them. In order to do that, we would have to make an investment in plant facility, we have to make a capital investment that would get those plants, those shipyards, the ones that are running already, up to the level where they could produce more boats. Submarines are called boats, and also to build new shipyards or develop ones that are already existing but could use an infusion of money to increase their output. There are other things we could do as well, but they're also politically difficult. Like, for example, to increase the size of the surface fleet by buying vessels that are made in other countries, or by making ships that are designed for the Navy ships like frigates in foreign shipyards, right? But that's very difficult because the name of the game in Congress when it comes to defense spending is how does it improve my jobs in my district? And if you build a Constellation class frigate in an Israeli shipyard, it's not going to be any dollars for any congressman in the House.
But it doesn't seem to me that congressmen are building ships anyway. So as long as they're not trying to build ships in China or places where we have other kinds of political problems, maybe we should be looking overseas. But again, we've kind of laid this, the president can say whatever he wants, and this president does say whatever he wants. But it seems to me the real problem is that Congress has to do the hard work, and maybe it's not ready to. Maybe it's not the American public that's at issue here. Maybe it's Congress. Because let me throw another one at you. We're kind of coming to the end, and I just want to toss things at you because this is really very educational as I see it. You mentioned right-sizing the military, including expanding the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force. What happens if people don't want to serve? Not only don't want to serve, but I read somewhere recently that only about 23% of the American public that is of enlistment age, so I think they were going like 18 to 25 or whatever that was, qualified for service. What do we do if we don't have the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines? Do we need a draft? Do we need more money? I don't know.
Well, a draft is not going to improve the physical standards.
That's right.
Of the military. You'll just get other people, a larger pool of people who are, for various reasons, disqualified. A few questions occur. Have we recruited to the level that we could? Can we offer more inducements, that is to say, money, to encourage young people to join the military? Do we know what sorts of things, why it is that they're not joining the military?
No, I don't think we do.
No, I don't think we do either. Can we? Is there anything we can do securely and safely to offer people who are about to qualify for citizenship improved access to American citizenship in exchange for military service? I mean, if we start to think about Shoshana, the real issue here is this a problem that is so pressing that we need to start doing things that we haven't done before? Or can we just kind of figure, just use baling wire and Band-Aids to kind of muddle our way out of it? And the prevailing ideas and culture, both within the military and in the political, in Congress and the administration, is that if we are in an interwar period today, we are not in a pre-war period. I don't agree. I think we are in a pre-war period. And changing the way you think about that, changing the way we think about that, is the key to starting to achieve the kinds of objectives that you're talking about?
So we're coming to the end of the program, and you've just said something that's sort of upsetting to me. I agree that we are in a pre-war period, that muddling along and hoping that everything just plays out for the next period. This is insufficient. But also, people who listen to this program periodically know that I like to go out on a positive note. So do you have a positive statement to make at the end of this program about our ability to find the political, social, military resources to change our thinking before we have to, before Pearl Harbor comes, before, you know, an attack on New York City comes again? Can we do this?
I think we could. But the first question that comes to my mind when in answer to yours is, what is an example of where we have done this as a country before?
Well, I would say 9/11 is one. Now, we didn't go to war in that sense, but the coming together of the public is one. Pearl Harbor, clearly.
But
Other than that, I'm not sure.
No, but Shoshana, I understand your question to be this. What can we say positively about the United States' ability to anticipate this so that instead of reacting to some horrific event, we anticipate it?
That's a good way to phrase it.
And my question to you was, can you think of an example where in the past where we have anticipated?
Oh, no. No, I
Okay,
cannot.
so
But you're ruining the end of my program by not leaving us on a positive note here, Seth. I would say we do not anticipate very well. We react decently. We've come out of wars better than we went into them in certain cases, but anticipating, no, I don't think so.
Well, let me try to. First of all, I agree with you, but let me try to be positive here, because I've been accused of being a Cassandra before. You're not the first person I've heard this from. So, President Reagan came into office and said that his strategy, somebody asked him what his strategy was, and he said his strategy was simple. We win, they lose. Okay, it was, a shorthand, but he was able to have a powerful effect on the outcome of the Cold War, absent a crisis. There was no crisis like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. There was a serious morale problem with the military. There had been President Reagan came to office after 4 years of severe underfunding from the Carter administration. Indeed, that was a campaign issue in 1980. And he was a very good leader, and he was able to make the justification convincingly to the American public and to a Congress that didn't always agree with him, that military defense spending had to be increased, and it worked. So I don't think that we have. I think we still have leaders who can make those arguments and who can be convincing and articulate. So I don't think that we're doomed. And I don't think that the only way to galvanize the public is by a massive and spectacular reverse. I think it's possible that leadership, articulate, intelligent leadership, moderate, intelligent, articulate leadership could get the country to do the right thing and bring Congress along.
Okay, so I accept that as a positive answer. We have in our history turned up leaders, both in Congress and in the executive, who are leaders, who are able to bring the public to where the public needs to be. So now we know what we're looking for. We're looking for those men and those women in our institutions to bring that information to the public and move with it. And that's not a bad place to end. Seth, this has been really, really enlightening. I'm not sure we went where you wanted to go or where you thought we were going. But I think it gives people a very good look at where we need to go and how we need to prepare to, as you say in the Yorktown Institute's website, secure the blessings of liberty. We shouldn't forget that. That's in our Constitution. It's in our foundational material, and we need to go for that. So thank you again for a great presentation.
Thanks for the opportunity, Shoshana.